Hi everyone, welcome to lecture number 4. Week 4 lecture. You've had more than 4 lectures now. I met a whole bunch of you yesterday, so I'm recording this on a Thursday, and I met a bunch of you in the week 3 Wednesday tutorial, and it was great. It was lovely to meet you all. Hopefully, I'll meet most of the rest of you soon. I know a couple of you are doing the unit remotely, so we'll stay in touch virtually. But yeah, lovely to have met so many of you yesterday, and it was really great to be back in a classroom after a unfortunate, abrupt little break, and I hope I can continue to get to do it. So, hi, welcome. I'm going to just share my screen so we can jump straight into the lecture. If you have any questions, if you missed yesterday, then just reach out or keep an eye out for any announcements. Anything important that comes up that needs to be shared, I'll send an announcement. But I've also uploaded the slides from yesterday just so you can kind of see what we did and you can see where there was a bit of there might have been additional things that were clarified about pestle analysis in the assignment as well. But if I think of anything that came up verbally that wasn't on the slides, I'll post that as well. But at the moment, I don't think there was too much. But just reach out if you weren't there and you're confused about anything or need any help with anything. So I will just share my screen. Takes a moment. This one. There we go. Okay. And I'll just grab my little notes. There we go. Hello, everyone. Again, welcome to week 4. We are focused this week on crisis communication planning, which we definitely started to allude to this in last week's lecture and in this week's tutorial. It does follow on really nicely from that pre-crisis stage that we covered last week as well, and that risk analysis kind of stuff as well that we're kind of doing on a kind of ongoing basis because of your next assignment. So yeah, we're going to talk about crisis communication planning. So it's a little bit shorter as well than last week. There's a little bit less kind of housekeeping to cover this time around, but I will still talk a bit about the next assignment because people are always, there'll be people who are thinking ahead and wanting to know how to do the next bit. And if you're not really up to that yet, you can just skip that part and come back to it another time. But what I'm going to do in this lecture is talk you through what a crisis communication plan is, what's the point of it, why is it useful? And that can be tricky because all crisis communication plans will inevitably change as a crisis unfolds. And it never really happens the way you might prepare in your mind that it's going to happen. And so we'll explore why this is the case and what some of those challenges are. I'll run you through some essential steps for creating a crisis communication plan as well. And also in the tutorial, we will spend some time looking at a template and maybe a couple of examples as well, and we'll have a bit more of a discussion about that as well. And I'll post those templates and I'll post that information as well. There are already some resources in the assignment information, which I think Caroline put up a bunch of things in week 2 that are up as well. So have a look through that list of all those links that are in there as well. But crisis plans are important. They're very useful to have in place, which I'll explain as we go as well. I also, as I was saying, I'm going to talk through a little bit of assignment 1B, just for people who are starting to prepare for that, or I know some people have already started working on it, and just a little bit about just what to do before next week. So, what is a crisis communication plan? And to shorthand things a bit, I've put CCP as an acronym on the slides from this point onwards. So when you see CCP, that's Crisis Communication Plan. And so the clue is in the title as to what it is. It is what it sounds like, but it is essentially a plan for how you are going to communicate if and when a crisis evolves, and also after a crisis as well. They can be useful. So it's a plan of attack so that you can kind of hit the ground running in essence. And people will use it often organizations will often use it as a reference tool to use during an emergency that they've deemed in their risk assessment as being likely to happen. And so it will include things like guidelines and a bit of a plan for how to communicate with the public. Sometimes there are templates of specific things to say or specific things to post. And also how to communicate internally with employees and other key stakeholders if and when a crisis unfolds. So a strong crisis plan will specify who takes responsibility for various aspects of the crisis response, and also what kinds of the way that information is going to be disseminated and distributed, and kind of how you're going to monitor responses and respond accordingly, all of that kind of thing. Organizations do often have business continuity plans as well, and this helps provide information about how to keep operations running smoothly during a crisis, and it helps them plan for those kind of internal operations. So that is different from a crisis communication plan, because it's not just about communicating internally and externally, but it's also about how do we keep everything working, how do we keep operations going while this is playing out as well. So a little bit more on what is a CCP. It's important to realize that crisis plans are different from or crisis communication plans, sorry, are different from business continuity plans, which are generally more about how to keep a business working during a crisis and what are the mitigation strategies, how are we going to adapt, and so on. But a CCP is different from an emergency response plan as well, which is more focused on upholding and managing safety in an organization. So it's important to realize that if there is an emergency response plan or a business continuity plan or both, because of an issue where it's come up that there's a particular threat to an organization that is likely to lead to a crisis, then an organization should also devise a crisis communication plan. So essentially, they go hand in hand, and although all three types of plans are distinct from one another, you will often need to have a CCP if you have either or both of these other types of plans as well. So the point of a crisis communication plan is that it is prepared in advance. It's prepared before a crisis happens, but it's following a risk analysis, which we're in the process of doing for assignment 1 and which we've been covering since week 2. And so assignments 1A and 1B, you're kind of doing an example of one of these for an organization, for a real organization. And so by developing a crisis communication plan after that risk assessment phase, organizations can be much better prepared to respond to significant threats that have been identified during that risk analysis work. So a crisis communication plan is not required for every risk or threat that's been identified during risk assessment. It's only necessary for threats that have been deemed likely to lead to a crisis, but also where the potential impact of that crisis is deemed to be quite high. So this will make sense when you complete assignment 1B, which we're talking about a bit later in the lecture as well. You'll probably click a little bit, okay, that's how you work out which ones to prioritize and which ones you would then do a crisis plan about. So there's a component of risk analysis that we're obviously further exploring while you prepare for assignment 1B, where you think about the risks that you identified in the PESTEL analysis, which you've recently done, or some of you are working on now because I've given you a bit more time. But in terms of how you would think about those risks, how likely it is that those risks might eventuate, what level of impact they're likely to have, and then from that information you can ascertain, okay, these are the ones we need to prioritize, these are the ones where there needs to be a crisis communication plan because this is likely to happen and it's likely to be bad if it happens. So CCPs follow this part of risk assessment. So when you do your risk assessment matrix, that kind of gives you that information that you would need to decide if a crisis communication plan is necessary. Rightio. Okay, why is it useful? Why would it be necessary? And it might be quite an obvious thing, but it might not. But essentially, a crisis communication plan allows you to preemptively think through what you might need to do in response to a crisis. And in turn, you'll be more equipped to prepare statements, to prepare spokespeople, and to even put in place some practice crisis scenarios so that you're ready to really get in there. The last thing you want in a crisis is to push someone in front of a camera, for example, to respond to questions from reporters, and those reporters know more about the situation or more about the kind of public perception than your representative does. And so to stop things like that from happening, you need to have a strategy already in place. So you can, as I said before, hit that ground running. And this can involve things like preparing spokespeople and making statements for them to make, or templates and plans for statements for them to make. And then to do that, you would want to imagine that crisis unfolding so that when it does happen, you've kind of done a lot of that legwork already. And you save a ton of time, which is really, really crucial in these situations. But another thing about crisis plans or being in place for these sorts of things is that you can then also understand the dynamic nature of a crisis a bit better. And so a crisis response will always need to be quite adaptable as the situation plays out in real time, because you can have a really great crisis plan in place, but then something different comes up, or the crisis unfolds in a way that you didn't quite prepare for. That's very normal. So with all this in mind, why should organizations have one? I've probably already answered this by saying it saves a ton of time, but we were talking last week about pre-crisis communication, and this is a stage. The preparation of a CCP is really part of that pre-crisis communication, as we talked about last week. So rather than waiting until after a crisis has begun to unfold and there's already heaps of communication and information, potentially reputational damage already being done, you want to have a plan in place. You don't want to be waiting. So, crises can develop and gain traction very fast, and you often you have to be ready to jump into action as soon as possible. There's a really famous saying that I think is kind of relevant here about how mis and disinformation, or like harmful narratives in general, will often do an entire lap of the universe before the truth has even put its boots on. And I think that that can be really relevant in these kinds of major crises. There will be situations where an organization doesn't really have much control of the narrative by the time there's a lot of narrative out there. And some of that may or may not be true. Maybe all of it's true, but it's doing a lot of harm and it's confusing people. So having a bit of a plan in place so you can really be ready to hit that ground running is so essential. So it is much easier to jump into action to respond to a crisis when there's already something to work with, rather than having to develop your communication plan from scratch. And so when there's already things, as I said before, when there's already public attention mounting and certain narratives that you maybe didn't want out there, or maybe don't really reflect what's going on, it's a lot easier if you've already got a response ready, or you've already said some things before that happens, and you can get out in front of it much more swiftly. And so by saving that sort of valuable time that a CCP can help you save, that can reduce the negative impacts of a crisis and the reputational damage. And it can also be more, it also can be seen as safer and a better outcome for your key stakeholders, because you're ensuring that they have access to good and important information as soon as possible, and they can adapt more readily to the situation as it unfolds. So one of your readings for this week talks about contingency theory, which is also important as it points out the context. The idea that context is absolutely crucial when thinking about the best way to respond to a crisis. So with any crisis, there are always things that happen that an organization will not have accounted for. And that means you should always react to the crisis as it happens and use your instinct, your values, and ethical practices as kind of determining guidelines for how you respond. And it's worth keeping in mind that a really good crisis communication plan can't be too rigid, it can't be too predefined, because, as we were saying before, the way a crisis unfolds will often, in some ways, have a mind of its own, and there might be unexpected things that you have to respond to. So let's just say you've got a CCP for a product failure, and then a product failure happens. You would not necessarily say, well, we've got a crisis communication plan, let's just follow that word for word to the T. That's never a good idea. You would still need to bring this kind of organizational awareness and contextual awareness and your understanding of what's going on in society in a given moment in time, and then make sure all of those factors inform your response to the crisis at hand. So you would end up tweaking and adapting your plan a little bit as you go. But each crisis is different, and thus it demands a different response. There are mediating issues. As I was saying before, each crisis will have different kind of quirks that you may not prepare for, but there are also different levels of organizational responsibility. So you might think, okay, it's either the organization's fault or it's not. But it's actually quite rare for people to have a really clear and universally agreed upon idea of who is at fault in a crisis. And you've probably seen examples of this in the real world, where it's like, oh God, where do we begin with this? So there was an example, for instance, of Mattel. They had a supplier who was using toxic paint in some of their toy paints, and Mattel decided to kind of shift the blame, which didn't go down well, because while they believed that they had little organizational responsibility, as far as the public was concerned, Mattel was responsible for who their suppliers were. And so by completely denying responsibility, they did lose a lot of trust. And so all that kind of stuff is contextual, and it's crucial to understand not just how you view things like organizational responsibility, but how the public and or your broader stakeholders are going to view organizational responsibility. And then you want to keep those kinds of things in mind and tailor the crisis response appropriately based on as much of that information as possible. But to obtain that information, you have to plan, and that's why a CCP can be so useful. So, how do you create one? And so, I'm going to go into a bit more detail about what these kind of six key steps are. And I realized after I put this together that I'm going to talk about them in slightly different order, which I'll explain in a moment. But that first step would be to identify potential risks. What are the risks? And you've kind of already been doing that with the PESTLE part of your analysis. The second part would be once you've identified what risks you might respond to and you've done that risk assessment, you would then want to work out who your crisis response team is going to be, who's going to be responsible for what and why. I actually think this would come after identifying your key stakeholders, though, and thinking about impacts on those, because I think that third point here on the slide about identifying stakeholders, that would be kind of part of that initial risk assessment, because you're thinking about who's going to be impacted and why and how. So I would actually put these two the other way around. But then after you've done those first three things, you want to designate some strong spokespersons. So kind of as the next step after working out your crisis team, you think about who is going to be a good person to articulate your messages, and I'll explain that a bit more shortly. But you also want to work out what crisis communication channels you will use. Work out what these will be and how you will use them, and what might work for certain purposes and certain audiences. And that does require you to have a really good understanding of your stakeholders and your publics. And then lastly, you would work out some specific responses and your specific kind of examples and actions that you're going to put into place. And that's done as a team effort. So I'll explain these in a little bit more detail. I've got a slide for each one. It was fun to pick pictures for them too. So first and foremost, you would need to look at your risk analysis and imagine the crisis unfolding. And in doing so, you can plan for best and worst case scenarios and be really ready to respond to those swiftly, but also responsibly. So this might require you to think about the potential impacts for all stakeholders and for the organization. And then hopefully, provided you've done a really solid risk analysis, you'll have a lot of information already available to you to help inform your response. And as part of this step, you should also consider the ethical obligations for safety and care, which is really crucial, as prioritizing the well-being of your stakeholders is paramount, as we talked about last week. And if you think about the ethics content that we did talk about, and that particularly that care element of it, centering stakeholder safety to inform crisis communication decisions is best practice. So that really feeds into this next point. You must identify your main stakeholders and consider the impacts of a crisis for each of them. So these stakeholders might include employees, customers, business partners, collaborators, the media, the broader public. There could be others, political figures that are involved in some way. There are lots. Other businesses who are who, as I said, collaborators. There could be other people who are doing similar work that you've worked with, or maybe they're involved in some way because the crisis might relate to intellectual property theft, or someone alleging that. There are all kinds of different stakeholders depending on the issue at hand, and so that is an early part of the analysis that you have to do, an early part of the planning that you have to carry out. So as I noted already, you must understand the ethical obligations to take care of those stakeholders. And then based on this, you need to be prepared to get to work in ensuring that the plan you implement is really focused on protecting those stakeholders as much as possible. And okay, so the next point, you would want to establish a response team. So think a bit about the roles and skills and level of responsibility that will be essential for implementing the plan, or for putting the information out into the world in the way that is going to be, firstly, I guess, prioritizing that safety and care, but also upholding a more positive reputation for your organization, and giving all stakeholders that clear, important access to information that they need as well. And so this could include certain spokespeople, possible external consultants, people within an organization. You might have academic experts who know a lot about the issue at hand and you want to talk to them as well. Even just really, really excellent communicators that you've worked with in the past who are really great at getting messages out in a certain way, and they're very trusted public figures, for example. And so this whole team, once you've worked out who they are and what their roles are going to be, that the idea is that the team will work together, will work collaboratively to make sure public messaging is clear, consistent, in line with the plan, but also adaptable to the changing circumstances of what's happening. And those members should have, specifically defined roles and responsibilities, as I was saying before. So the next step, once you've kind of got a team in place, is to really think about the appropriate communication, like an appropriate person who would be a good spokesperson, and what kind of channels they would need to use, because these 2 points, and it's step 4 and step 5, they do kind of go hand in hand, because the who kind of also sort of depends on the how, and the how will depend a little bit on the who. So if you're getting a particular influencer, for example, to say some things because it's there may be a brand ambassador for a brand, and the brand is having a crisis, and you've got this great influencer who's had a really who has a really strong following, and your customers tend to follow them and really love them. That could be a really strong person to have as a spokesperson. And in doing that, you would then be thinking, okay, well, the way that they tend to communicate is that they use a lot of social media. They're heavy on Instagram and TikTok, for example. And then that sort of, the spokesperson then kind of leads to what's the appropriate kind of channel for some of your messaging. And you'll probably have more than one. I've put spokespersons here, the S is in brackets, because you may have one main spokesperson, you may have a few depending on your strategy, or depending how big the organization is as well. So there's a few things to think about there, but you're essentially designating a representative with strong public speaking and critical thinking skills, thinking about kind of how you will determine the best spokesperson who can speak to the people that you want to speak to in a way that's effective. It gets your key messages out. It's strong. It makes sense. It's not confusing. I probably wouldn't be the best at this because I am a little bit long-winded in how I explain things, and I get excited and go off on tangents. In a crisis, though, you'd probably want somebody who can really is really quick and to the point, but also clear, and also says the important things that need to be said. So it's important here that the spokesperson or spokespeople is really clear and straightforward communicator, but also an empathetic person who can really help to uphold trust among key stakeholders. So, for example, by ensuring that the appropriate people are kept in the loop as new developments emerge, you want a spokesperson who can do that and understands the importance of that. And for example, if you're representing a retail brand, then a really honest and transparent and charismatic communicator can really help reassure customers whose faith in an organization can really be make or break for not just reputation, but also the capacity to even stay in business. So that's really important too. And as I was saying before, a basic part of strategic communication is thinking about the channels as well, and the spokespeople and the chosen channels do kind of go hand in hand. So this is where you're thinking about communication methods and channels, and it may involve just thinking about what kinds of technology infrastructures you would need to use or tap into, both internally and externally. And these are going to be really important for providing really accurate and consistent updates. So if you're a brand, for example, and the majority, most people tend to get information about you from social media, you're probably going to be more inclined to focus your response on social media. But those really, really big organizations will probably need a social media kind of response, as well as a kind of broader media kind of responses as well, to capture more people. It really does depend. You have to be thinking about your publics and your stakeholders in terms of the sort of what then works best in terms of the vehicle for how you get that information out to people. And so as an example that's on the slide here is that organizations should have mobile friendly plans in place in case their crisis is the result of an issue like a technological problem, or there are computer systems that are damaged, like maybe it's a weather event or a natural disaster. That could be what's the sort of cause or source of the crisis. So having things in place that don't rely on certain technologies that could be damaged as a result of the crisis is important. And those kinds of systems can then also help reduce human error in gathering and sharing accurate information during a crisis. So there's no definitive way to do this because it depends on your stakeholders, it depends on the type of business, it depends on your publics, how they get information about you, the size of the organization, your resources, money, what's available to you, who your spokespeople are. There are so many variables to what the appropriate communication methods are. And when you have a really solid plan in place and you've already thought this through, then it's going to be a much faster, swift response, and where there's a bit more thought behind it as well. So in terms of, this is where you get to the next bit where you think about, okay, we've thought about the how, we've thought about the who, we've thought about the why. Now we need to think about, okay, what are we going to say? What's actually going to be, what are we putting out into the world? So the next step is to really start working up some generic statements and response templates. So these are statements that you expect your spokespeople will need to make at some stage of the crisis. And again, they won't just be determined ahead of time and then repeated verbatim without reflection or adaptation to the crisis as it plays out. Instead, they will be useful to you will want to use them as a kind of jumping off point, and you will adapt and you will tweak, and you will then save a ton of time because you won't have to think about them from scratch if you've already got something to work with. So you would do something like think, okay, what kinds of generic statements should we prepare in advance? And who will say them? Who's going to be the best for what statements? And when you've worked out, at this point, you would have worked out, okay, we're going to do some social media posts. We're maybe going to send some internal emails and keep our internal stakeholders up to date that way as well. We'll have a little intranet page where we keep things open. We'll have a little FAQ section on our website. And we'll also maybe chat to a couple of trusted media outlets and present some key messages that way that they can report on. So maybe that's the plan in general in terms of who and how it's going to get out there. But you will just be thinking that you do want to have some things ready for when that starts to happen so that you can then adapt that information and then put it out there. So when you start doing your crisis simulation exercises in this unit, you will see that a large part of that simulation involves choosing appropriate statements for certain scenarios. And so that's where you see examples of what kinds of things you may or may not say. And as you start working through it, you'll be getting feedback when you've chosen a response that's really great. It will tell you why it's a good response. When you've chosen a response that's maybe okay, but it's not the best option, then it will explain why as well. And that's really helpful for working out, okay, for example, the responses that are kind of just saying, oh, we didn't do anything wrong and just denying can do more harm than good. So it's a bit of a spoiler that those ones are usually not the best ones to pick. And the ones that emphasize strengths a bit more, but also maintain a very kind of professional tone that's very centered in upholding stakeholder needs and safety and all that kind of thing, they tend to fare better. But a crisis team will generally develop response guidelines, or they should develop response guidelines for things like press inquiries and social media posts. And like, as I was saying before, there could be different templates or different kind of plans of what to say. You might think of, these are the kinds of messages we usually get when this kind of thing happens, or that we expect to get when this kind of thing happens. And here's some kind of template responses for each of those kinds of things. And you can kind of have that on hand to adapt as you go through as well. But one of the things that's useful also about doing this is that you can also ensure more messaging consistency, because your team is aware of what you want the approach to be. You've already discussed and agreed upon, okay, well, these are the kind of key messages we're going to want to get out. We need to stick to these. We need to be consistent with them, but also adaptable to the changing crisis. So it gives you just something to work with, and you're less likely to get kind of tripped up with, oh, wait, there's this other statement you put out that contradicts this completely, those kinds of things. So you want to see what these kinds of response templates, if you want to see what these kinds of response templates look like, I do recommend doing a Google search for crisis communication plans, because in those results, you'll then see a lot of specific kind of organizations' plans and some templates and stuff as well, and how they, and you know, there's often things in there about risks and threats and how organizations intend to respond to them. So I think that's a useful exercise to do. But as I was saying before, we're going to talk through a couple of examples and templates in class, and I've put there are some resources in modules, mostly in week 2, about risk analysis stuff, but there's also some crisis communication plans stuff, some resources in module 4 that you could check out as well. So definitely do that when you get a minute. So I'm also going to just briefly now introduce you to this idea of situational crisis communication theory, which, abbreviated to SCCT. This was developed by Coombs and Halliday, and it's one of the they come up a lot in this unit, and you'll notice particularly the work of Tim Coombs is mentioned a fair bit throughout this subject, as he is a significant researcher in crisis communication. And so he developed situational crisis communication theory, which suggests that there is essentially kind of like a formula that organizations and PR professionals can apply to crisis situations to help determine the proper response strategy that they might want to go down, the path that they want to go down for a specific type of crisis. So when you're kind of thinking about the real meat of what is a crisis communication plan, you might be thinking about, like, what's the level of organizational responsibility and what's the appropriate response depending on that responsibility. And then Coombs has kind of developed a bit of a guide for doing that, which I'll talk about briefly on the next slide. But as I've noted earlier in this lecture, we need to keep reminding ourselves and keep in mind that contextual factors and just the dynamic nature of a crisis does mean that you can't just follow a formula point by point. It's, at best, it's a guide. It might save you some time and some kind of that energy that goes into a lot of thinking and labor when you're trying to plan for a crisis. It won't guarantee that your response will be effective, but it could be really helpful, and it's kind of like a really good first step. So I'll show you, I don't know how, hopefully this is readable. If you need to make it a little bit bigger, then you can, but I have also, this is from the week 4 readings, which you can find via the Canvas reading list. It's the Coombs 2015 reading called The Value of Communication During a Crisis, Insights from Strategic Communication Research. So if you're having trouble reading this on the slide, then you can find this table just by going to that reading, which you have access to via Canvas. But just in essence, what this table is doing is it's showing, there's a list on the far left about that kind of the level of responsibility or the type of crisis situation and whether or not there's the organization has any responsibility in that. So in a situation where they don't have any responsibility, then the response strategy might be that they might use is denial, but then in the far right column, it talks about some potential outcomes of that. So maybe that would protect reputations, maybe it would reduce anger and the likelihood of negative word of mouth, but also sometimes denial can be seen as problematic. So you do have to be careful with that as well. So that's why that whole thing about context is important. And just for another example, there's one that talks about a competence-based crisis. And so one of the strategies for that kind of crisis might be adding more training, adjusting information, maybe putting out an apology about what's happened and, striving to do better. And a potential outcome of this might be protecting reputations and, keeping customers, for example, but also that might reduce anger as well. So this is kind of, again, as I said, this would not necessarily work this way for every type of crisis, but it's one way. It could be one useful tool to look at, and it is quite commonly applied, and it's commonly cited in the literature about crisis planning. So it's, again, as I said, it's a formula. It needs to be adapted. It needs to be thought about in terms of how it relates to a specific situation at hand. And so even Coombs says in the reading that this formula is impacted by levels of organizational responsibility, but a lot of contextual factors too. So, for instance, if an organization has a reputation for poor behavior, or they have a CEO that's known to be irresponsible, these are factors that can impact how a response is received by publics. And by stakeholders as well, and therefore these factors must be considered when preparing a crisis response strategy. You can't really do a mathematical equation for how to respond and it will just always work. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. But this table, as I said before, this table is in your first reading for this week, in case you want to look at the explanation a bit more and look at each component a bit more closely. And you might find it helpful for just getting your head around what kinds of response strategies are often seen to be appropriate or common, at least in certain scenarios. And we do look at situational crisis communication theory in a lot more detail later in the semester. We've got a week where we focus on it. So, but for now, I wanted you to have a bit more information about how context and individual factors can impact crisis communication planning. And the kind of big take-home point is that, there's really never going to be a one-size-fits-all kind of way of doing this. And I decided to include this reading in week 4 to encourage you to start thinking about these aspects a little bit more. So, but I do also want to point out that a good crisis communication strategy will make space for thinking through how to monitor the crisis through listening and through active engagement with key stakeholders. And this also involves some consideration of intended outcomes and a plan for evaluating the crisis response. So thinking through things like, what are we looking for? What are we wanting to achieve through this crisis plan? How might we monitor the success of it? How might we appraise whether or not it worked and what we need to change? How we evaluate whether we implemented it successfully and what might need to be done differently in the future? Because obviously in a crisis, there's a great opportunity to learn and reflect about ways to do better in the future as well. But just as a sort of take-home points here is that, a CCP is an example of a proactive pre-crisis communication strategy, as we talked about in week 3 when we talked about pre-crisis communication. And therefore, it is that sort of important next step, or it's the sort of outcome in a way of the risk assessment process, because it helps you identify those sort of key threats that need the most attention, that are most likely to lead to a crisis, but also the most likely to be impactful and need to be addressed quickly. So we've made this point quite a few times, no crises can or should be responded to in the same way. A well-devised and well-thought-out crisis plan will account for those contextual factors, such as different impacts for different stakeholders and differing levels of organizational responsibility, among many other things. And you will see, you'll get a chance to play around with this a bit with the simulation, which will hopefully be fun. So I want to spend a bit of time now, just before we wrap up. I want to just remind people about assignment 1B, and I'll talk you through it a little bit because I have had a couple of people start to ask me about it. And I want to make sure that the information is really clear, because obviously the lecture that we reshared, that was last year's content about these assignments, this assignment used to be one assignment where 1A and 1B were combined, and you did a PESTLE analysis and a risk assessment matrix and a summary, and then handed that in all in one go. And I think it was in week 4 or something. But now the university has a policy where you have to have an assignment submitted in either week 2 or 3, and then students get feedback in week 4. So we had to, because there's going to be something so early, we decided to break them. Myself and my colleagues talked about it and decided to break this one in half. So there's 1A worth 10% and 1B worth 10%. So if anyone was confused about the lecture that initially just talks about doing risk analysis, Tal would have been talking about this as though it's one assignment, but it is in 2 parts. So, but if anyone submitted both for assignment 1A, that's fine. You could just submit that same thing the second time, or you can, based on the information I'm about to share, you can adapt it and submit it for 1B, and I'll just and that's totally fine. But hopefully the information is clear now in Canvas. I've made sure the Canvas information is accurate. It's just if you had relied on that lecture, it might have sounded like it was one big assignment, but it's actually 2 parts. So you will have, by the time you're reading this, by the time you're watching this lecture, most of you will have finished and submitted assignment 1A, unless you have an extension or you're still working on it. But assignment 1B is sort of the next part, and that's where you do a risk assessment matrix and a 250-word summary. And that's due on Friday, the 14th of March at 6 p.m. Loosely 6 p.m. in Canberra time, as I was saying yesterday in the tutorial for anyone that missed that. I basically have a loose rule that I will set assignments as being due on a Friday to encourage people to still, use their weekend as a weekend and try to get it done before the weekend. But that's not always possible, especially if you work full time, you're juggling a lot of things. Maybe the weekend you really rely on that time to get assignments done. And if that's the case, I don't mind you submitting it on the Saturday or Sunday of that same week, so the 15th or 16th. I will consider it submitted on time if it's there when I check on Monday morning. So just putting that out there again. I set these deadlines as a Friday, and I do encourage people to try to meet that, but it means that you're not at a disadvantage if you really can't get something done by the end of a week by 6 p.m. as well. So that's just keeping in mind the differing kind of circumstances that people have. So I will do a post to remind people of that at some point, but just keep that in mind. And so, but I want to explain this assessment a bit. So when you do a risk assessment matrix, or a RAM, we'll call it, you are required to rank the 5 most significant reputational risks to the organisation that you focused on in assignment 1A. So you would have picked from the list for assignment 1A, you would have picked an organisation and done that initial analysis where you looked at different types of potential reputational risks based on your research into the organisation, and you've identified them and explained why they might be risks. But now you will go to the next point and try to work out, okay, which of the risks that you identified during that first exercise, that PESTLE exercise, which ones do you think might be important to focus on? And that does require your own kind of critical thinking a bit. And I just want to clarify something. It originally said that you were going to rank 10 significant reputational risks, but I think given that you're only doing a 250 word summary, now I think it's more realistic for you to just focus on 5 and make it just a little bit smaller, and you'll be able to say a little bit more because there'll be a little bit more room if you've got 5, if you only do 5. So I've clarified and updated that in the assignment information as well. If you've already started this and you've done 10, then you can just edit it now down. You can edit it down to 5 now and make it a bit more focused that way. So, and then the other 5 that you've looked at, you've already done all this great work, which will be helpful for the rest of the unit. So, so I did make this a little bit smaller of a task than it originally was. But you will also, in addition to doing the risk assessment matrix, which I'll talk you through in a minute, you will also submit a 250-word summary to accompany it, and that provides basic details about the chosen organisation and summarises the kind of main takeaways from your RAM analysis. And so there's more details in Tao's lecture from week 2. So when Tao took this unit last year, he gave a lecture about doing risk analysis. So it's worth looking back through that and just ignore the specifics about the assignment, because obviously that would have been relevant to last year. But you can find also there are additional resources in Module 2 under the additional resources heading. And that talks through things like doing ESG ratings and using Google Trends and all those kinds of things that you might find useful as well. So definitely check those out. But a couple of things, so just a couple of sort of steps of doing this. I wanted to break it down a little bit. So when you create a risk matrix, you're sort of defining, thinking through some criteria for risk severity and weighing that up against likelihood. So you might have a list when you think about your 5 different risks that you've identified. For each one of these, you want to think about how severe the impact would likely be, and also how likely this risk is to actually lead to a crisis. And when both of those are high, then that's a high risk, a high impact situation that needs attention and needs a crisis plan. If, let's say, you've got low severity or negligible, if you're looking at this slide, negligible severity, but it's very likely, then that might be more of a moderate impact because the severity is not that serious, but it's likely to happen, so it's still important. It might still be somewhat important to address or to try to mitigate. Maybe it's the other way around. It's not necessarily going to, it is going to have a severe impact if it happens, but it's not that likely, but that still makes it medium impact because if it does happen, it could be quite bad. Or maybe maybe it's negligible severity, but also not that likely. In that case, it's considered a low risk. So essentially, it's likelihood and severity. You look at both of those things and then work out the impact that way. So the criteria on this slide can be helpful for doing that first step. So what I would do is, you've worked out the 5 risks you want to focus on for the assignment, or the 5 threats. Maybe you'll just pick one from 5 of the 6 different PESTLE categories if you wanted to. That might be the way that you do it, but you pick 5 that you think are important based on your research. And then for each one of those 5, do this little exercise where you say, okay, how likely do I think this is based on my research, or based on what I know about this company, or based on things that might have happened in the past, but also how much of a problem would it be if this happened? Work out that, and then you can get to the next point, which I'll show you now. You'd want to then create a table that looks a little bit like this. It doesn't have to be exactly like this, and you don't have to use this color coding system, but I thought it was useful because it sort of follows along from the sort of traffic lights thing, where green is go and red is stop. Yellow is that sort of middle ground where you have to think a little bit, which I always find anxiety provoking when I'm driving. But anyway, that's a whole other thing. But so when you've kind of done this little exercise where you've worked out where each of your threats might fit in terms of the level of severity and and also the likelihood, you can kind of map them onto a diagram that looks like this, where you might have those different levels of likelihood on one side and the different levels of severity on the other axis, and then create a kind of grid. And then based on your assessment from the previous step, you can kind of map those 5. On here, they've got more than 5, but you will do 5 for your assignment. You can map those 5 threats onto this diagram. And the color coding here, as I was explaining, was that green is would be low impact, the sort of orangey yellow color would be medium impact, and red would be high. Again, you don't have to follow this. You might want to use different shades of purple, or you might have a different kind of approach to it, but this is just an easy visual one for the lecture that I wanted to show you. So you would put something together that looks a little bit like this, and then in your 250 word summary, you would just explain a little bit about how you arrived at that. So you could potentially, for that, just have a small heading for each of those 5 risks, and then a sentence or 2 that explains, this is why, this is how I came to this assessment, and it's based on this not being that likely to happen, but being potentially high risk, so it's in that sort of middle category. And then you want to say something like there might be 2 or 3 risks or threats that are in that really high impact category, because they are likely, and they would also have quite a serious impact if they happen, and therefore those are the ones that would need a crisis communication plan later on, or pretty soon actually. So including something that explains that would be useful. But I did get a bit ahead of myself, because I just remembered I have a slide for the 250 word summary. So this would be, again, you would have that initial description of who your organization is, which is 1 or 2 sentences, and you can literally just lift that out from your PESTLE analysis that you've already submitted, and just say, hey, I chose Commonwealth Bank. They're a bank. Well, they do this, blah, blah, blah. And that could just be really brief, and you can just take that straight from the PESTLE. And then where you want to spend a bit more time is, say, explain why you've identified your 5 risks as having the most serious impact and likelihood, and why. So you kind of just explain how you arrived at your RAM analysis. So severity times likelihood equals impact. And an important thing just to remind you about is that whenever you include information that has come from another source, or it's been informed by something that you've read, you need to include an in-text reference, so just the author name and date, or the organization name and date, and then include the longer in-text reference at the end of the document. And I've included a link to the Canberra referencing guide that is linked in modules, in the student resources bit of modules, but I've also linked it on this slide, which will also be put up by the time you see this lecture. You'll be able to download the slides as well. And just a reminder that all kinds of references don't contribute to the word count. So when you've added references within your document, it'll be longer than 250 words, and there's also no word limit for the RAM bit itself, and that's the same thing for the PESTLE. They're as long and as detailed as they need to be, and then it's just the summary that you add to the end that would be shorter. It would be 250 words. So I hope that makes sense. Just reach out if anything is not clear, or you can ask a question using the discussion tab in Canvas as well. But that brings us to the end. Before next week, you want to obviously attend our tutorial on Wednesday if you're able to. If you're not able to, then and you haven't already let me know, then let me know. And if you have any questions or you're worried about anything that you've missed, then just reach out, or just again use the discussion board. That can be helpful too. And any important things or important announcements I'll put up in Canvas. So obviously work through the readings for the next week, for week 5. Make sure you are familiar with what you need to do for assignment 1B. And the earlier you ask questions or flag any issues, the better. But I've updated and added more detail for that and added some resources, so hopefully that will be helpful. You also want to, I've sent out an announcement with more instructions about accessing the Stukent Simternship, and there are resources in the module section of Canvas under the Stukent Simternship resources heading, or the Student Internship heading. Make sure you're familiar with what you're going to need to do. Make sure you know how to get in and create your account, and make sure you watch my introductory lecture about this as well, so that you know what you need to do, and that you're ready to hit the ground running with that. By the time you're watching this lecture, you will probably be starting to work through the week 4 stuff, but make sure that in preparation for week 5, then you know what's expected of you as well. And again, I've already said this, if you've got queries about anything at all that you think other students might benefit from seeing the response to, then use the Canvas discussion board for that in the first instance. And if it's a question that's more about yourself, so you need more time or for something, or you are going to miss a class, then obviously that's more of an email Ashley kind of scenario. That's it from me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Oopsie daisy. There we go. Stop sharing. There we go. You saw my very blank desktop on my other screen. Hi, okay, I'm back. Thank you so much for watching. As I said before, reach out if I can assist with anything before we meet again. I hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you all very soon. Bye, everyone.